You ever have one of those moments? You're at home, you put your keys down on the kitchen counter. You know you did. You saw it. You felt it. A few minutes later, you go to grab them, and they're not there. They're on the coffee table in the living room. There's a flash of confusion, a disorienting second where reality feels soft. You dismiss it naturally. You were just distracted. You misremembered. But what if you didn't? What if, for a split second, you caught a glitch? A tiny rendering error in the world's code before a background process corrected the object's location? It's a strange thought, the kind you'd normally push away, except some of the smartest people in the world, philosophers, physicists, cosmologists, are now arguing that this feeling might be pointing to a fundamental truth. They've built a logical case using surprisingly simple math that leads to a staggering conclusion. The odds that we are living in a base-level physical reality are billions to 1 against, that our universe is almost certainly a simulation. Welcome to the deep dive. So yeah, that premise that we might just be, I don't know, digital ghosts in some kind of post-human machine, it's really moved way beyond just like science fiction tropes.
Oh, absolutely. It's become a serious topic of debate.
And that's what we're doing today. We are diving deep into this, well, monumental debate. It really starts with these profound philosophical questions, about what the mind even is. And then it goes all the way to like rigorous physics, actual experiments designed to try and, well, falsify reality itself. It's pretty wild.
It is.
We're drawing from those core arguments, the statistical ones mainly, that kind of push the simulation hypothesis into the, let's say, the mainstream discussion.
Right, the arguments that make you really stop and think.
Exactly. But then we're also going to look hard at the scientific counter-evidence, the physicists who are basically saying, hang on a second, that sounds physically impossible based on what we know.
Yeah, that's a critical piece. It's a beautifully constructed piece of logic, though. The initial argument comes mainly from philosopher Nick Bostrom.
Right.
And the whole thing really crystallizes into what people call the trilemma. It's these 3 staggering propositions, and they're mutually exclusive.
Meaning only one can be true.
Exactly. At least one of these must be true. You can't logically escape it. It's a disjunction.
Okay, so what are the 3 paths?
Okay, so the first path is that the human species, or any species like us, is very likely to go extinct before we ever reach what's called a post-human stage.
Post-human meaning technologically super mature, like super intelligence and all that.
Precisely. We don't get there. We wipe ourselves out or collapse somehow first. That's often called the doom scenario.
Grim. Okay, what's the second one?
Second path. Post-human civilizations, if they come to exist, they turn out to be, well, virtually uninterested in running these huge, detailed historical simulations of their past.
They're ancestors, basically, simulating us.
Yeah, these ancestor simulations.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, they just don't bother doing it, even if they could.
All right, and the third path, the one that gets all the attention.
That's the kicker. The third path is that we are almost certainly already living inside a computer simulation.
Wow. So the logic is, if the first 2 aren't true,
then the third one has to be true, and with very high probability. That's the structure of the argument.
Okay, so our mission today then is to really unpack all of this. We need to look at the evidence, the arguments for each possibility.
Right.
We'll start by building that statistical case for hypothesis 3, the simulation one. Then we'll dig into why post-humans might not run simulations. Hypothesis 2, maybe ethics.
Motivation.
Yeah, and then, crucially, we're going to spend a good chunk of time on the physics, the fundamental limits of information, energy, the stuff that suggests maybe the whole matrix idea just doesn't work physically.
And that's where things get really interesting, because it might force us toward a completely different way of thinking about reality.
A radical new interpretation. Okay, let's dive in. All right, so this whole simulation hypothesis, it doesn't actually start with computers or physics, does it? It starts with philosophy of mind.
That's right. The entire logical structure really hinges on this one widely accepted idea in philosophy. Substrate independence.
Substrate independence. Okay, break that down for us. What does that actually mean in simple terms?
It basically means that consciousness, your subjective experience, your thoughts, your feeling of being you, isn't tied to the specific physical stuff it runs on.
Like it doesn't have to be a brain made of neurons.
Exactly. The idea is that consciousness is a process. It's about the structure, the function, the pattern of information processing. If you can replicate that pattern, that computational structure,
then the consciousness emerges regardless of whether it's running on, say, carbon-based wetware like our brains or silicon chips in some future computer.
That's the core premise. It's the organization and the complexity of the computation that matters, not the underlying material, the substrate.
Okay, that's a pretty big philosophical assumption, but let's run with it. If we accept that, how does it change the game for simulating a mind? Does it suddenly become easier?
It makes it potentially feasible, which is the key.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily need to simulate reality down to the level of every single quark and electron interaction inside every brain cell.
Which would be computationally insane.
Completely impossible, yeah. But if substrate independence holds, the argument is you only need to replicate the computational processes accurately. Simulating down to the level of individual synapses might be enough.
So you're simulating the connections and the firing pattern, the information flow, but not necessarily the messy biological details of neurotransmitters.
Pretty much. Think about it.
Yeah.
Those chemicals, the neurotransmitters, they matter in biology because they influence how neurons fire and connect. They affect the computation.
Right.
So if your digital model can perfectly replicate the outcome of that influence, the resulting firing patterns, the network activity, then the simulated brain running on silicon or whatever should, in theory, have the same subjective conscious experience. You're simulating the network's behavior, not every last molecule.
Okay, that definitely lowers the bar from utterly impossible to, well, maybe just staggeringly difficult.
Exactly. It shifts the problem from simulating a quantum universe inside a brain to simulating a hyper-complex information processing network. Still incredibly hard, but different.
And this is where the post-human part comes in. We're not talking about our computers today.
Not at all. Our current supercomputers, even the best ones, are completely irrelevant to this calculation. We have to imagine a civilization that has reached, full technological maturity, superintelligence, nanotechnology, mastery over matter and energy.
And the kind of computing power they could wield. What are the estimates?
They're astronomical, really. Even using conservative estimates based on known physics and plausible nanotech designs, nothing too sci-fi a computer built using the mass of a single planet.
Just one planet.
Just one planet's worth of matter, optimally arranged for computation, could potentially achieve something like 10 to the power of 42 operations per second?
10, with 42 zeros after it. Per second.
Per second. It's a number that's hard to really wrap your head around.
For comparison, our fastest supercomputers now are, 10 to the 18?
Around that, yeah. Maybe a bit more now, but in that ballpark. So we're talking about something like 10 to the 24 times more powerful, a trillion times more powerful, just from one planetary computer.
Wow, okay. So they have the horsepower. Now, how much does it cost computationally to simulate one conscious human mind?
Right. That's the other side of the equation. Estimates vary depending on the required fidelity, but a reasonable range for simulating a single human brain's mental history per second of simulated time is somewhere between 10 to the 33 and 10 to the 36 operations.
Okay, let's take the high end, 10 to the 36 operations per brain per second, and compare that to the 10 to the 42 operations available from that one planetary computer.
You do the math. 10 to the 42 divided by 10 to the 36. That's 10 to the 6.
A million.
A million. That single planetary mass computer could potentially run 1 million fully conscious human simulations simultaneously in real time.
And that's just one computer, maybe one of many, in one post-human civilization.
Exactly. Even if they used only a tiny fraction of their available resources for this kind of thing, they could still run a vast number of ancestor simulations, hundreds of billions, maybe trillions across their whole civilization over time.
So the technological capability seems plausible, assuming they reach that post-human stage. And that's where the statistics really start to bite.
This is the crux of it. If even a small fraction of post-human civilizations that could exist actually do exist and decide to run these ancestor simulations,
then the sheer number of simulated minds, simulated experiences like ours, starts to absolutely dwarf the number of original biological minds that ever existed in base reality.
Precisely. The total number of simulated observers rockets upwards. The fraction of all observers with human-type experiences who are living inside simulations, let's call that fraction FIS, starts getting incredibly close to 1, like 99.999% or 99.99999% or even more.
And once you establish those kinds of odds, we, sitting here right now, have to apply that logic to ourselves, don't we? Because we don't have any special information telling us we're not in a simulation.
That's the application of a bland indifference principle. If you have no specific evidence to the contrary, you should assume you're typical. if 99.999% of observers with experiences like yours are simulated.
Then you have to rationally conclude that you are almost certainly one of them. You should assign a 99.999% probability or credence to the simulation hypothesis being true for you.
Exactly. Your subjective feeling of being real, of being biological. That's precisely what the simulation is designed to produce. It gives you no evidence, no way to distinguish yourself from the simulated multitudes.
It's a chilling thought because it feels so impersonal. It's just cold, hard probability based on potential post-human computing power.
It is. It's like Bostrom's analogy. Imagine a huge urn filled with balls. Billions of balls are black, representing simulated minds, and maybe only a handful are white, representing original biological minds. You reach in and pull out a ball of your consciousness. Without looking, what color should you rationally bet it is?
Black. Overwhelmingly likely to be black.
Right. That's the statistical force of the argument for hypothesis 3. Unless
one of the other two paths in the trilemma is true.
Exactly. Unless we go extinct first, or unless those post-humans, for some reason, just don't run the simulations.
Okay, so the logic seems tight. We're pushed towards hypothesis 3, that we're simulated, unless we can make a strong case for hypothesis 1, extinction, or hypothesis 2, universal disinterest. Let's tackle those escape routes. First, the really grim one. Hypothesis 1, the doom scenario.
Right. Hypothesis 1 basically says that civilizations like ours almost inevitably destroy themselves or collapse before they reach that post-human stage, before they get the chance to build those planet-sized computers and run ancestor simulations.
Does it have to be like nuclear war or asteroid impact, or can it be more subtle?
It could be anything, really. War, runaway climate change, pandemics, resource depletion leading to collapse. Anything that prevents the long-term technological ascent to superintelligence and simulation capability.
But there's one specific threat often mentioned in this context, isn't there? Something related to nanotechnology.
Yeah, the classic, almost canonical example of a potential doom technology is mature molecular nanotechnology. Specifically, the idea of self-replicating nanobots.
Like microscopic machines that build copies of themselves.
Exactly. Sometimes called assemblers, or more dramatically, mechanical bacteria. If these were designed, say, to consume biomass or raw materials to replicate,
you get the gray goo scenario.
You potentially get the gray goose scenario. If they escape control or are deployed maliciously, they could theoretically convert the entire biosphere into more nanobots, causing the extinction of all original life.
And for hypothesis 1 to hold true, this kind of self-destruction or some kind of insurmountable barrier has to be almost universal, right? It has to stop pretty much every civilization that gets close.
That's the key constraint. The failure rate has to be incredibly high, approaching 100%. Because if even one civilization makes it through, reaches the post-human stage, and decides to run simulations,
then bam, the number of simulated minds explodes, and we're right back to hypothesis 3 being the most likely.
Correct. So hypothesis 1 requires that there's some kind of great filter, some near insurmountable technological or existential challenge that reliably prevents civilizations from reaching the simulation running stage.
Okay, so let's assume, maybe optimistically, that we don't all go extinct. That pushes us on to hypothesis 2.
Right. Hypothesis 2, post-humans exist, they have the capability, but they choose not to run ancestor simulations. Virtually all of them converge on this decision.
Why? What would make them collectively decide against it? The main argument seems to be ethics, right?
That's the leading contender, the ethical convergence idea. The core argument is that running simulations containing conscious beings capable of suffering is profoundly immoral, and post-human societies recognize this and prohibit it.
But, I mean, we create human life now, and while there are ethical debates, we generally don't see the act of creation itself as inherently immoral. Why would post-humans feel so differently about creating simulated life?
The argument often centers on the extreme power imbalance and the concept of vulnerability. When post-humans create, say, whole-brain emulations, perfect digital copies of past humans or sims,
they're essentially playing God.
Literally. They impose existence non-consensually onto these beings. And these simulated beings are then totally dependent on their creators for everything. Their environment, their needs, their continued existence, their protection from suffering.
They live entirely at the mercy of the simulators.
Absolutely. The creator could pause them, delete them, edit their memories, subject them to horrible experiments, or just accidentally cause immense suffering through, like, coding errors or simulation glitches. This absolute arbitrary power over vulnerable conscious beings imposed without consent Many ethicists argue that's the fundamental moral problem.
So it's not just the risk of suffering, it's the inherent state of total non-consensual subjection.
That's a strong component of the ethical argument, yes. The Sims are created into a state of profound vulnerability and dependence.
Could they try to mitigate that? Like, could they have rules, oversight bodies, ethical review boards for simulations?
They could try. You could imagine things analogous to our institutional review boards, IRBs, that oversee research on human subjects, or maybe even some kind of licensing for sim creators, like parental licensing ideas that have been floated.
But the sources we looked at seemed skeptical that would be enough. Why?
Because even post-human creators are likely still fallible beings. Any centralized oversight body run by the creators is susceptible to the same problems we see in human institutions. Conflicts of interest, regulatory capture, biases, and just the basic difficulty of truly understanding and protecting the welfare of beings in a completely different ontological state.
Especially when those beings have no real power to appeal or complain if things go wrong.
Precisely. If the creators hold all the cards, including the power to shut down the oversight committee or ignore its findings, can you really trust the system to protect the Sims? It seems inherently fragile.
That makes the ethical barrier seem almost insurmountable unless the system itself changes.
Some argue the only way it might be ethically permissible is through some kind of competitive, polycentric system. Imagine if Sims weren't locked into one simulation, but could somehow choose to migrate their consciousness to a different simulation provider, voting with their virtual feet.
So market forces would incentivize providers to treat their Sims well, to provide a good environment, to attract and retain residents.
That's the idea. Competition might force ethical behavior where centralized regulation fails, but requiring all post-human societies that could run Sims to converge on this specific, complex, ethically robust institutional setup, well, that makes hypothesis 2 a very tall order. It requires an extraordinary level of universal ethical agreement and sophisticated implementation.
Okay, so ethics is one major reason for disinterest. Are there others? What if it's not morals, but just motivation?
That's the other angle for hypothesis 2. Maybe ancestor simulations just aren't considered worth the effort.
Like scientifically boring.
Could be. Post-humans might already know everything about their past or find the questions answerable by ancestor sims just uninteresting compared to whatever else they could be doing with their vast intellects and resources. The scientific payoff might seem negligible to them.
Or maybe recreationally boring.
Possibly. Or perhaps just inefficient. If their goal is pleasure or interesting experiences, why go to the immense trouble of running billions of complex conscious sims in a historical drama when you could presumably use advanced neurotechnology to directly stimulate your own brain's reward centers and experience perfect bliss or infinite novelty instantly?
Right. Direct brain stimulation seems way more efficient if hedonism is the goal.
So if either this profound ethical prohibition or this universal lack of scientific or recreational motivation holds true across virtually all post-human civilizations, then hypothesis 2 stands, and we avoid the simulation conclusion.
But again, it requires near-perfect convergence. If even a few post-humans remain curious or nostalgic or just plain mischievous,
then they run the Sims, and hypothesis 3 likely wins the numbers game.
Okay, we've mapped out the simulation logic, H3, and the two main ways out. Extinction, H1, or universal disinterest, likely driven by ethics or motivation, H2. Now, we pivot. We bring in the physicists.
Right. This is where the argument shifts dramatically from philosophy and probability to hard science and physical constraints. The physicists basically say, okay, let's assume you want to run this simulation. Can you actually do it according to the laws of physics as we know them?
Because the core idea here is that information isn't just abstract, right? Information is physical.
That's the absolute key. Storing a bit, flipping a bit, running any computation requires energy, it takes up space, it takes time, and all of that has to obey fundamental physical laws. If our universe is a simulation, it needs a computer, and that computer must exist in some other parent universe.
And if we assume that parent universe operates under the same basic physical laws as ours,
then we can calculate the physical requirements, the energy budget, the power demands, the information density limits for running our reality.
And the main tool physicists use to set these fundamental limits, especially on information, is something called the holographic principle.
Yes, the holographic principle, or HP. It's a really deep concept emerging from studies of black holes and quantum gravity. It fundamentally limits how much information can be packed into a given region of space.
And counterintuitively, it's not based on the volume, is it?
No, that's the weird part. It scales with the surface area of the boundary of that region. not the 3D volume inside. Think of it like a hologram. All the information to reconstruct the 3D image is somehow encoded on a 2D surface.
So reality's information limit is like its skin?
In a manner of speaking, yeah. The absolute maximum information density is about 1 bit per Planck area. And the Planck area is unimaginably tiny, about 10 to the minus 66 square centimeters. This gives us a rock-solid, fundamental, and actually quite low upper limit on the information content of any physical system.
And storing information takes energy.
Always. There's a minimum energy cost related to the amount of information and the temperature of the system. If you try to cram too much information into one place, the energy required just to represent that information can become enormous, potentially even exceeding the total energy of the system itself.
Okay, let's apply this. Grand scenario. Simulating the entire visible universe down to the Planck scale. Every quantum fluctuation possible.
According to physics as we know it, absolutely not. Definitively impossible.
Why? What do the numbers say?
Okay, so using the holographic principle, the total information capacity of our observable universe is estimated to be around 3.5 times 10 to the 124 bits, a huge number.
Okay.
But the minimum energy required just to encode or store that much information, even at the coldest possible temperature, the cosmic microwave background, is calculated to be about 8.9 times 10 to the 108 ergs.
And how much energy is actually in our universe?
The total mass energy content of the visible universe is estimated at around 2.7 times 10 to the 78 ergs.
Whoa. So the energy needed just to store the blueprint of our universe is, what, like 10 to the 30 times more energy than our entire universe contains?
Exactly. By many, many orders of magnitude. So a civilization living in a universe like ours simply could not build a computer capable of storing the data needed to simulate another similar universe down to the fundamental level. The universe in a box simulation is out.
Okay, scratch the whole universe. Let's scale way back. What about just simulating planet Earth? Faithfully down to the Planck scale.
Still runs into catastrophic problems. Simulating just Earth down to the Planck level would require storing about 9.8 times 10 to the 74 bits. The initial energy to store that is already immense equivalent to the mass energy of a whole globular cluster of stars.
But the real killer isn't just storage, right? It's running the thing.
It's the processing. Yeah, the time step problem. You don't just store the data once. You have to constantly update it, process the interactions, run the physics engine for it in time. And each computational step, each tiny tick of the simulation clock dissipates energy.
And how much energy are we talking per step?
Roughly that same enormous amount, the globular cluster's worth, has to be managed or dissipated for every single time step. If the simulation runs at the Planck time resolution, which is incredibly fast, then after just, say, 1,000,000 time steps, a tiny fraction of a second in simulated time, the total energy processed and dissipated would equal the entire rest mass energy of the Milky Way galaxy.
So the simulation computer would basically evaporate itself instantly from the waste heat.
Pretty much. It's just thermodynamically untenable. The power requirements are astronomical.
Okay, so simulating perfectly down to the quantum level is out, even for just Earth. This forces the physicists to ask, what's the absolute minimum resolution a simulation could get away with and still look like our reality based on actual experiments?
This is the crucial empirical test. We have to look at the limits set by our best observations. And some of the best constraints come from detecting extremely high energy particles from space.
You mentioned ultra-high energy neutrinos before. Why are they so important?
Because these things are like tiny, incredibly energetic bullets fired from distant cosmic accelerators. We've detected neutrinos with energies up to 10 to the 17 electron volts, maybe higher. They travel across the cosmos and zip right through the entire Earth.
Okay. How does that constrain a simulation?
Well, if reality is a simulation, it must run on some kind of underlying grid or lattice structure like the pixels on a screen, but for space-time. For these super high energy neutrinos to travel through that grid correctly, following the laws of physics like special relativity, conservation of energy and momentum, without weird artifacts.
Like getting stuck or jumping gaps or losing energy in ways they shouldn't.
Exactly. The grid spacing, the simulation's resolution, has to be incredibly fine. The higher the energy of the particle you need to simulate accurately, the finer the grid needs to be. These neutrino observations force the minimum possible grid size, let's call it lambda nu, down to about 1.2 times 10 to the minus 21 centimeters.
That's so ridiculously small, way smaller than an atomic nucleus, but much larger than the Planck length.
It is. It's the lowest resolution scientifically allowed by current data. Any coarser, And we should be seeing strange effects with these high-energy particles, which we don't.
So even at this lowest possible resolution, what's the information cost? Still huge.
Oh, yeah. Rescaling the holographic principle to this minimum resolution still means you need to store about 1.65 times 10 to the 51 bits just for Earth. A massive number. But again, the real catastrophe isn't the storage, it's the processing needed to keep it running.
The time step problem again. How fast do you need to update this low-res grid?
To correctly propagate those 10 to the 17 EV neutrinos across this grid, respecting causality and relativity, you need an incredibly short minimum computational time step. It works out to about 4.1 times 10 to the minus 32 seconds.
So you have to update the entire state of the simulated Earth, something like 10 to the 31 times every second.
That's the requirement, yes. You're performing roughly 10 to the 31 operations per bit per second across those 10 to the 51 bits.
The total power requirement must be just nonsensical.
It's completely off the charts. To run this lowest resolution, empirically constrained simulation of Earth in real time requires a power dissipation rate somewhere between 10 to the 73 and 10 to the 74 ergs per second.
Give us that cosmic context again. How big is that number?
It utterly dwarfs everything else. The total power output of all the stars in the entire visible universe combined is maybe 10 to the 55 ergs per second. The most powerful explosions we know, like gamma ray bursts, peak around 10 to the 54. This simulation requires a continuous power flow that is billions upon billions, like 10 to the 19 or 10 to the 20 times greater than the output of everything in the known cosmos.
So unless the parent universe has wildly different physics or access to energy sources beyond our comprehension,
then running even this most basic, low-resolution simulation consistent with our observations is physically impossible. The computer would require more power than exists in its own universe.
So the conclusion seems pretty stark from the physics side.
It really is. Based on physics as we currently understand it and experimental data we currently have, the matrix scenario, a simulation of our world run by descendants or aliens using technology within a universe governed by familiar physical laws, appears to be scientifically untenable due to these fundamental information and energy constraints.
Okay, this leaves us in a really strange place. We have this compelling statistical argument saying we're almost certainly simulated, H3. But then we have this seemingly insurmountable physics barrier saying that kind of simulation is impossible for a civilization bound by our laws.
It's a profound paradox. The math pushes us one way, the physics pushes back hard.
So if the standard matrix simulation is physically impossible, we're forced back to the other options in the trilemma. Either we are doomed to extinction before we can build such things, H1, or virtually all advanced civilizations choose not to run them, H2.
Or there's a third way, a way that questions the fundamental assumptions underlying the physics calculation itself.
This is where things get really philosophical again. The self-simulation hypothesis, or SSH.
Exactly. The SSH is a kind of radical ontological move. It accepts the core idea that reality is informational, that we might be in a simulation, but it throws out the need for a physical computer in an external parent universe.
How does it do that? If it's information, doesn't it need to be processed somewhere?
SSH takes a different stance on the nature of information itself. It leans toward a form of panpsychism or idealism. It suggests that fundamentally everything is information, but information is defined as thought or consciousness.
So the universe isn't a physical machine running a simulation. The universe is a kind of giant thought process.
That's the essence of it. It proposes that the universe self-actualizes, brings itself into existence through a kind of strange loop based on mathematical code and something called the principle of efficient language. The simulation isn't a fake reality inside a physical base reality. The simulation is the reality, because reality itself is fundamentally mental or informational. The physical computer running on energy becomes an unnecessary artifact of materialist assumption.
That sounds incredibly speculative. How does this connect back to anything testable? Or does it solve any existing problems?
Well, proponents argue that it offers a potential ontological grounding for quantum mechanics, particularly the measurement problem.
The mystery of why possibilities seem to collapse into definite reality when measured.
Right. In the SSH framework, conscious observers entities capable of thought and choice play a fundamental role. Their acts of observation and choice are what influence the underlying code syntax of the universal consciousness, effectively causing the collapse of the wave function. It's the universe measuring itself through its conscious constituents.
So consciousness isn't just a passenger, it's actively involved in shaping reality moment by moment. Kind of like those old consciousness causes collapse interpretations.
Very similar in spirit to ideas from Wigner or Stapp, yes. The simulation isn't running on hardware, it's running in the software of universal thought. And our conscious minds are part of that process.
And they point to things like dreams as evidence that mind can simulate reality effectively.
That's a common argument. Look at lucid dreams, subjective mind-generated realities that can achieve incredibly high fidelity, sometimes feeling completely indistinguishable from waking reality. The argument is, if an individual mind can do that without needing planet-sized computers or dissipating galaxy-level energy,
then maybe mind-based or thought-based systems are just fundamentally better, more efficient simulators than physical computers could ever be.
that's the inference they draw, suggesting the physics constraints we calculated might only apply to materialistic simulations, not thought-based ones.
How does SSH picture the structure of this thought-based reality? You mentioned a hierarchy.
Yeah, it typically defines two interacting levels or regimes of information thought. First, there's what they might call emergent physical thought, EP. This is like the base code, self-referential, symbolic thought, dealing with concepts like number, geometry, mathematical structures. This is what manifests as space-time, particles, the laws of physics.
The hardware specs, almost, but made of thought.
Kind of. And then emerging from the complexity of that physical structure, you get emergent consciousness thought, EC. This is the higher level stuff. Non-self-referential symbolic thought, like our sense of self, free will, abstract ideas, emotions, politics, art.
And the flow of time relates to this.
Yes, the perceived arrow of time is seen as corresponding to the continuous generation and increasing complexity of both EP and EC information as conscious entities within the universe make observations and choices, evolving the state of the universal thought process.
Okay, SSH is definitely a fascinating alternative way to think about it. But does it truly escape the computational problems we found earlier? If we need a shared, consistent reality for science to work, doesn't that still require immense calculation, even if it's thought?
That's the absolutely crucial question, and where SSH might still run into trouble depending on how you interpret it. If the simulation is purely solipsistic, if it's only simulating the activity of your individual mind, like a personalized dream or Descartes' evil genius scenario,
Then yeah, the physics constraints probably don't apply.
simulating one mind might be cheap.
Exactly. A Boltzmann brain scenario, a lone consciousness hallucinating a universe, doesn't need to simulate high-energy neutrinos consistently for billions of other observers.
But as soon as you demand a shared reality, one where my neutrino detection experiment agrees with yours, where the laws of physics are consistent for everyone,
then you're right back to needing that incredibly high-fidelity, high-update rate calculation across the entire shared environment. You still need to compute the trajectories of those 10 to the 17 EV neutrinos consistently for all observers who might potentially interact with them. The computational load seems to reappear regardless of whether you call the substrate matter or thought, unless thought has some magical property allowing infinite calculation for free.
So even SSH might not fully escape the implications of those neutrino calculations if it aims to explain our shared scientific reality. It seems that way. And ultimately, we have to acknowledge the limits of testing any of these deep ontological hypotheses. Our physics calculations, our constraints, they only really apply rigorously to simulations run within parent universes that broadly follow the same physical rules we observe.
If the simulators live in some radically different reality with different laws, different energy conservation, maybe non-local computation,
Then all bets are off. We can't falsify it from here. It moves beyond science into pure speculation.
Okay, so let's try to synthesize this. It's quite a journey. We started with this powerful statistical argument, almost mathematical certainty, pushing us towards hypothesis 3. We are simulated.
Driven by that assumption of substrate independence and the sheer potential computing power of post-human civilizations.
But then we slammed into this wall of physics. The fundamental limits of information and energy, dictated by the holographic principle and confirmed by real-world particle physics experiments, seem to make the standard matrix-style simulation physically impossible for any civilization operating under known laws.
The energy budget just doesn't work. Not even close. Especially when you account for the processing power needed for real-time updates at the required resolution.
That scientific impossibility is a huge blow to the standard simulation hypothesis. It really forces us back, doesn't it? It seems to leave us staring squarely at the other two options from the trilemma.
It really does. If a physically plausible simulation run by descendants is off the table, then we are firmly stuck between those other two propositions. Either hypothesis one is true, our civilization, and likely any other, is doomed to fail before reaching that post-human simulation-capable stage.
The great filter is ahead of us, or perhaps we're in it now.
Or hypothesis two is true, that virtually all civilizations that do reach the post-human stage make a conscious, collective decision not to run ancestor simulations, perhaps due to insurmountable ethical concerns about sim suffering and vulnerability, or maybe just a profound lack of interest or motivation.
Neither of those feels particularly comforting, but the physics seems to box us into that corner.
It's a stark choice presented by the combined force of the logic and the physics.
Reflecting on this whole deep dive, perhaps the most surprising, almost paradoxical thought that emerges is about testing the hypothesis itself.
How so?
Well, we just established how physically demanding, likely impossible, it is to run even a low-resolution simulation in real time according to our physics.
Right.
So if we, our civilization, somehow overcame all that, if we actually did manage to create and successfully run our own high-fidelity ancestor simulation, complete with conscious beings inside.
Ah, I see where you're going.
That very act, the achievement of doing the thing physics suggests, is impossible for a base reality civilization. That would itself become the single most compelling piece of evidence we could possibly have that hypothesis 3 is true.
Because it would strongly imply that our physics, the physics that made it seem impossible, isn't the ultimate base-level physics. That we are operating under the simulated laws of a higher reality that can support such computation.
Exactly. Successfully creating the matrix would be the best proof that we are already in the matrix.